Chapter 2 on the plane of self-consciousness. And in the first place, it would be well to get a firm hold of the meaning of the words self-consciousness, upon the definition of which an excellent writer and most competent thinker has had these remarks. Self-consciousness is often referred to as a distinguishing characteristic of man. Many, however, fail to gain a clear conception of what this faculty is. Dr. Carpenter confounds it with the power of reflecting on their own mental states, while Mr. Darwin associates it with abstraction and other of the derivative faculties. It is certainly something much simpler than introspection and has an earlier origin than the highly derivative speculative faculties. If it could only be seized and clearly understood, self-consciousness would doubtless prove to be the primary and fundamental human attribute. Our language seems to lack the proper word to express it in its simplest form. Think approaches this most nearly, and man is sometimes described as a thinking being. The German language has a better word, viz. Besinnen, and the substantive besonnades seems to touch the kernel of the problem. Schopenhauer says the animal lives without any besonnades. It has consciousness, i.e. it knows itself and its weal and woe, and also the objects which produce these, but its knowledge remains constantly subjective, never becoming objective. Everything that it embraces appears to exist in and of itself and can therefore never become an object of representation nor a problem for meditation. Its consciousness is thus wholly immanent. The consciousness of the savage man is similarly constituted in that his perceptions of things and of the world remain predominantly subjective and immanent. He perceives things in the world, but not the world, his own actions and passion, but not himself. Perhaps the simplest definition, and there are scores of them, would be self-consciousness is the faculty by which we realize. Or again, without self-consciousness, a sentient creature can know, but its possession is necessary in order that he may know that he knows. The best treatise so far written on this subject is Romaine's book, already several times referred to. The roots of the tree of life being deep sunk in the organic world, its trunk is made up as follows. Beginning at the earth level, we have first of all the lowest forms of life, unconscious and insensate. These in turn give birth to forms endowed with sensation and later to forms endowed with simple consciousness. From the last, when the right time comes, springs self-consciousness, and, as already said, in direct ascent from that cosmic consciousness, it only is necessary in this place as clearing the ground for the work to be done, to point out that the doctrine of the unfolding of the human being regarded from the side of psychology is strictly in accord with the theory of evolution in general as received and taught today by the foremost thinkers. This tree, which we call life and its upper human life and human mind, has simply grown as grows any other tree, and besides its main stem, as above indicated, it has, as in the case of other trees, thrown off many branches. It will be well to consider some of these. It will be seen that some of them are given off from the lower part of the trunk as, for instance, contractility, from which great limb, and as a part of it springs all muscular action from the simple movement of the worm to the marvelously coordinated motions made in the exercise of their art by a Liszt or a Paderewski. Another of these large lower limbs is the instinct of self-preservation, and twin with it, the instinct of the continuance of the species, the preservation of the race. Higher up, the special senses shoot out from the main trunk, and as they grow and divide and again divide, they become large and vitally important branches of the great tree. From all these main offshoots spring smaller arms, and from these more delicate twigs. Thus, from the human intellect, whose central fact is self-consciousness, a section of the main trunk of our tree, spring judgment, reason, comparison, imagination, abstraction, reflection, generalization. From the moral or emotional nature, one of the largest and most important of the main limbs, springs love, itself a great branch dividing into many smaller branches, reverence, faith, fear, awe, hope, hate, humor, and many more. The great branch called the sense of sight, which in its beginning was a perception of the difference between light and darkness, sent out twigs which we call sense of form, of distance, and later of the color sense. The limb-named sense of hearing has for branches and twigs the apprehension of loudness, pitch, of distance, of direction, and as a delicate twig just coming into being, the musical sense. Part 2. The important fact to notice at present is that, true to the simile of the tree here adopted, the numerous faculties of which, viewed from the side of dynamics, man is composed are all of different ages. Each one of them came into simple existence in its own time, i.e., when the psychic organism, the tree, was ready to produce it. For instance, simple consciousness many millions of years ago, self-consciousness perhaps 300,000 years. General vision is enormously old, but the color sense probably only about 1,000 generations, believe it or not. Sensibility to sound many millions of years, while the musical sense is now in the act of appearing and continuously evolving. Sexual instinct or passion arose far back in geologic ages. The human moral nature, of which humans sexually love each other, is a young and vigorous branch, does not appear to have been in existence many tens of thousands of years. Part 3. To make what has been and what remains to be said more readily and more fully intelligible, it will be well to go into some little details as to the time and mode of becoming and developing of a few faculties as a sample of the divine work that has been going on within us and about us since the dawn of life on this planet. The science of human psychology, in order to illustrate the subject of this volume, should give an account of the human intellect, of the human moral nature, and of the senses. Should give a description of these as they exist today, of their origin and evolution, and should forecast their future course of either decay or further expansion. Only a few, very few specimen pages of such a work can be here set forth, and first with a hasty glance at the intellect. The intellect is that part of the mind which knows, as the moral nature is the part that feels. Each particular act of the intellect is instantaneous, whereas the acts, or rather states, of the moral nature are more or less continuous. Language corresponds to the intellect and is therefore capable of expressing it perfectly and directly itself. On the other hand, the functions of the moral nature, belonging, i.e., deriving as they do from the great sympathetic nervous system, while the intellect and speech rest upon and spring from the cerebrospinal, are not connected with language and are only capable of indirect and imperfect expression by its agency. Perhaps music, which certainly has its roots in the moral nature, is, as at present existing, the beginning of a language which will tally and express emotions as words tally and express ideas. Intellectual acts are complex and decomposable into many parts. Moral states are either absolute simple, as in the case of love, fear, hate, or nearly so. That is, are composed of comparatively few elements. All intellectual acts are alike or nearly alike in that regard. Moral states have a very wide range of degree intensity. The human intellect is made up principally of concepts, just as a forest is made up of trees or a city of houses. These concepts are mental images of things, acts, or relations. The registration of these we call memory, the comparison of them, one without another reasoning. For the building up of these up into more complex images, as bricks are built into a house, we have in English no good expression. We sometimes call this act imagination, the act of forming a mental copy or likeness. The Germans have a better name for it. They call it Vorstellung, the act of placing before. Anschauungsgabe, the gift of looking upon, and better still, Einbildungskraft, the power of building up. Wow, okay. The large intellect is that in which the number of concepts is above the average. The fine intellect is that in which these are clear-cut and well-defined. The ready intellect is that in which they are easily and quickly accessible when wanted, and so on. The growth of the human intellect is the growth of the concepts, i.e. the multiplication of the more simple and at the same time the building up of these into others more and more complex. Although this increase in number and complexity is taking place constantly in every active mind during at least the first half of life, from infancy to middle age, and though we each know that we have concepts now that we had not some time ago, yet probably the wisest of us could not tell from observation made upon his own mind just by what process these new concepts came into existence, where they came from, or how they came. But Though we cannot perceive this by direct observation either of our own mind or of another person, still there is another way by which the occult process can be followed, and that is by means of language. As said above, language is the exact tally of the intellect. For every concept there is a word or words, and for every word there is a concept. Neither can exist apart from the other. So Trench says, you cannot impart to any man more than the words which he understands either now contain or can be made intelligibly to him to contain. Or as Max Muller expresses it, without speech, no reason, without reason, no speech. Speech and the intellect do not correspond with one another in this way by accident. The relation between them is inevitably involved in the nature of the two things. Or are they two things? Or two sides of one thing? No word can come into being except as an expression of a concept. Neither can a new concept be formed without the formation at the same time of the new word, which is an expression, though this new word may be spelled and pronounced as is some old word. But an old word taking on another and a new meaning in reality becomes two words. And an old and new. Intellect and speech fit in one another as the hand and the glove, only far more closely, say rather they fit as the skin fits the body, whereas the pia matter fits the brain, or as any given species in the organic world is fitted by its environment. As is implied in which has been said, it is to be especially noted that not only does language fit into the intellect in the sense of covering it in every part and following all its turnings and windings, but it fits it also in the sense of not going beyond it. Words correspond with concepts and with concepts only, so that we cannot express directly with them either sense impressions or emotions, but are forced to always to convey these, if at all, by expressing not themselves, but the impressions they make upon our intellect, i.e., the concepts formed from the contemplation of them by the intellect, in other words, their intellectual image. So that before a sense impression or an emotion can be embodied or conveyed in language, a concept has to be formed, supposed more or less truly to represent it, which concept can, of course, be conveyed in words. But as a matter of fact, 99 out of every 100 of our sense impressions and emotions have never been represented in the intellect by concepts, and therefore remain unexpressed and inexpressible except imperfectly by roundabout description and suggestion. There exists in the lower animal a state of matters which serves well to illustrate this proposition. These have acute sense perceptions and strong emotions, such as fear, rage, sexual passion, and maternal love, and yet, at the same time, cannot express them because these have no language of their own, and the animals in question have no system of concepts with corresponding articulate sounds. Granted to our sense perceptions and our human moral natures, and we should be as dumb as they are, as the animals are, had we not along with these an intellect in which they may be mirrored and by which, by means of language, they can be expressed. As the correspondence of words and concepts is not casually or temporary, but resides in the nature of these and continues during all time and under all circumstances absolute constant, so changes in one of the factors must correspond with changes in the other. So evolution of intellect must, if it exists, be accompanied by evolution of language. And evolution of language, if it exists, will be evidence of evolution of intellect. What then is here proposed is to study for a few moments the growth of the intellect by means of examination of language, i.e., to study the birth, life, and growth of concepts which cannot be seen by means of words which are their co-relatives and which can be seen. Sir Charles Lyell, in The Antiquity of Man, pointed out the parallelism which exists between the origin, growth, decline, and death of languages and of species in the organic world. In order to illustrate and at the same time broaden the present argument, let us extend the parallel backward to the formation of the words and forward to the evolution of words and concepts. The accompanying table will serve this purpose as well as, or better than, an elaborately reasoned exposition, and will serve at the same time as a summary of the evolution argument which runs through this volume. A short study of this tabular statement will make plain how orbs, species, languages, and words branch, divide, and multiply, will make intelligible Max Muller's estimate that every thought that has ever passed through the mind of India may be reduced to 121 root concepts, that is, to 121 root words, will make us agree with him that probably that number might still be further reduced. If we consider for a moment that this means that the millions of Indo-European words now in use as well as many times the number how long since dead and forgotten. Nearly all spring from about 100 roots, and that these in their turn probably from half a dozen, and at the same time remember that reason and speech are one. We shall obtain a glimpse of what human intellect once was in comparison with what it is today, and likewise it will become apparent at the glance that the evolution not only of species, languages, and words is strictly parallel, but that the scheme has probably a still wider, perhaps universal application. As regards the present thesis, the conclusion to be drawn from this comparison is that words, and that therefore the constituent elements of the intellect which they represent and which we call concepts, grow by division and branching, as new species branch off from older. And it seems clear that a normal growth is encouraged and an excessive and useless development checked by the same means in the one case as in the other, that is, by natural selection and the struggle for existence. New concepts and words expressing them, which correspond with some external reality, whether this is a thing, an act, a state, or a relation, and which are therefore to us man, since their existence plays in him more complete relation with the outer world, on which relation his life and welfare depends, are preserved by the process of natural selection and survival of the fit test. Some again, which either do not correspond at all or only imperfectly with an objective reality, are replaced by others which do correspond or correspond better with the reality which these aim to express, and so in the struggle for existence fall into disuse and die out. For it is with words as with every other living thing, thousands are produced for one that lives. Toward whatever object the mind is especially turned, it throws out words, often with marvelous profusion. When some thousands of years ago, Sanskrit, being still a living language and the sun and fire looked upon either as actual gods or at least as especially sacred, fire had, instead of a very few names as now, 35 and the sun 37. But much more remarkable examples are those drawn from the Arabic, as for instance the 80 names for honey, the 200 for serpent, the 500 for lion, the 1,000 for sword, and the 5,744 words all relating to the camel, these being subjects upon which the Arab mind is strongly and persistently bent. So again, Max Muller tells us we can hardly form an idea of the boundless resources of dialects. When literary languages have stereotyped one general term, their dialects will supply 50, though each with its special shade of meaning. If new combinations of thoughts are evolved in the progress of society, dialects will readily supply the required names from the store of their so-called superfluous words, that are not only local and provincial, but also class dialects. There is a dialect of shepherds, of sportsmen, of soldiers, of farmers. I suppose there are few persons here present who could tell the exact meaning of a horse's poll, crest, withers, dock, hamstring, cannon, pastern, coronet, arm, jowl, and muzzle. Where the literary language speaks of the young of all sorts of animals, farmers, shepherds, and sportsmen would be ashamed to use such a general term. The idiom of nomads, as Grimm says, contain an abundant wealth of manifold expressions for swords and weapons, and for the different stages in the life of a cattle. In a more highly cultivated language, these expressions become burthensome and superfluous. But in a peasant's mouth, the bearing, calving, falling, and killing of almost every animal has its own peculiar term, as a sportsman delights in calling the gate and members of the game by different names. Thus Dame Juliana Berners, Lady Prioress of the Nunnery of Sockwell in the 15th century, the reputed author of the Book of St. Albans, informs us that we must not use names of multitudes promiscuously, but we are to say a congregion of people, a host of men, a fellowshippings of women, and a bevy of ladies. We must speak of a herd of heartsease, swannies, crannies, or rennies, a siege of herons, or bitories, a muster of peacockies, a watch of nightingales, a flight of doves, a clatterns of calves, a pride of lions, a sleuth of berries, a gaggle of gays, a skulk of foxes, a scully of friars, a pontificalent of prelates, abominable sight of monks, a drunken ship of cobblers, and so on and so forth, of other human and brute assemblages. In like manner, in dividing game for the table, the animals were not carved, but a deer was broken, a goose reared, a chicken frushed, a coney unlaced, a crane displayed, a curlew unjointed, a quail wiggened, a swan left, a lamb shouldered, a heron dismembered, a peacock disfigured, a salmon shined, a Hadoki slated, a soul loins, and a bream splayed. How about that? These instances will serve to show how the human intellect feels along the face of the outer world presented to it, attempting a lodgment in each cranny it finds, however slight and precarious may be the hold that it gets the point across, huh? For the mind of man from age to age ceaselessly seeks to master the facts of the outer world. Its growth indeed consists in tallying or covering these as ivy spreads over, tallies and covers the stones of a wall. The twig that secures and holds strengthens and puts out other twigs. That which does not secure a hold after a time ceases to grow and eventually dies, or I guess in other words becomes a new expression. The main thing to notice for our present purpose is that just as in the case of the child learning to talk, the race began also with a few, or as Geiger says, with a single word. That is to say, man began to think with very few or with a single concept. Of course, at that time and before, he had a large stock of percepts and recepts. Otherwise, he could have done little with his one or few concepts. From these few or that one, the enormous number of concepts and words that have since come into existence have proceeded. Nor will the evolution of the entire human intellect from a single initial concept seem incredible or even very marvelous to those who bear in mind that the whole complex human body, with all its tissues, organs, and parts, is built up of hundreds of millions of cells, each one of which, however much it may differ in structure and function from those belonging to other organs and tissues than its own, is yet linearly descended from the one single primordial cell in which each one of us, and only a few years ago, had his origin. As we reach back into the past, therefore, we find language, and with it the human intellect, drawing into a point. And we know that within a measurable distance from where we stand today, they must have both had their beginning. The date of that beginning has been approximately fixed by many writers and for many indications, and we could not be far away in placing it provisionally about 300,000 years anterior to our own times. Part 4. Much more modern than the birth of the intellect was that of the color sense. We have the authority of Max Muller for the statement that it is well known that the distinction of color is of late date, that Xenophanes knew of 3 colors of the rainbow only, purple, red, and yellow. And even Aristotle spoke of the tricolored rainbow, and that Democritus knew of no more than 4 colors, black, white, red, and yellow. That's interesting, huh? Geiger points out that it can only be proven by examination of language that as late in the life of the race as the time of the primitive Aryans, perhaps not more than 15 or 20,000 years ago, man was only conscious of, only perceived one color. That is to say, he did not distinguish any difference in tint between the blue sky, the green trees and grass, the brown or gray earth, and the golden and purple clouds of sunrise and sunset. So Pictet finds no names of colors in primitive Indo-European speech, and Max Muller finds no Sanskrit root whose meaning has any reference to color. At a later period, but still before the time of the oldest literary compositions now extant, the color sense was so far developed beyond this primitive condition that red and black were recognized as distinct. Still later, at the time when the bulk of the Rig Veda was composed, red, yellow, and black were recognized as 3 separate shades, but these 3 included all color that man at that age was capable of appreciating. Still later, white was added to the list and then green, but throughout Rig Veda, the Zend-Avesta, the Homeric poems, and the Bible, the color of the sky is not once mentioned, therefore apparently was not recognized. For the omission can hardly be attributed to accident. The 10,000 lines of the Rig Veda are largely occupied with descriptions of the sky and all its features. Sun, moon, stars, clouds, lightning, sunrise, and sunset are mentioned hundreds of times. So also the Zend-Avesta, to the writers of which light and fire, both terrestrial and heavenly, are sacred objects, could hardly have omitted by chance of the mention of the blue sky. In the Bible, the sky and heaven are mentioned more than 430 times, and still no mention is made of the color of the former. In no part of the world is the blue of the sky more intense than in Greece and Asia Minor, where the Homeric poems were composed. Is it possible to conceive that a poet or the poets who saw this as we see it now could write the 48 long books of the Iliad and Odyssey and were never once either mentioned or referred to it? Sorry. But were it possible to believe that all the poets of the Rig Veda, Zendavesta, Iliad, Odyssey, and Bible could have omitted the mention of the blue color of the sky by mere accident? Etymology would step in and assure us that 400,000 years ago, or perhaps three, blue was unknown. For at that time, the subsequent names for blue were all merged in the names for black. The English word blue and the German blau descend from a word that meant black. The Chinese he huan, which now means sky blue, formerly meant black. The word Nil, which now in Persian and Arabic means blue, is derived from the name Nile, that is the Black River, of which same word for the Latin Niger is a form. It does not seem possible that at the time when men recognized only two colors, which they called red and black, these appeared to them as red and black appear to us. Though just what the sensations were which so named cannot of course be now ascertained. Under the name red, it seems they included with that also the color white, yellow, and intermediate tints, while under the name black they seem to have included all shades of blue and green. As the sensations red and black came into existence by the division of an original unit color sensation, so in process of time these divided. First red divided into red-yellow, then that red into red-white. Black divided into black-green, then black again into black-blue, and during the last 2,500 years, these six, or rather these four, red, yellow, green, blue, have split up into enormous numbers of different shades of color which are now recognized and named today. The NX diagram below shows at a glance the order in which the spectrum colors became visible to man. It can be shown in an entirely independent manner that if the color sense did come into existence as here supposed, the successive order in which the colors are said, following ancient documents and etymology, to have been recognized by man is actually the order in which they must have been so recognized, and the scientific facts now about to be adduced must be admitted to be remarkably confirmatory of the above conclusions, while being drawn from sources entirely separate and distinct. The solar or other light rays that excite vision are named red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. These rays differ with the other one from the other in the length and amplitude of the waves which compose them, and both the length and amplitude of the waves diminish in the order in which the names have just been given. But the force or energy of a light wave, that is to say, its power of exciting vision, is proportional to the square of its amplitude. Especially it is. According to this law, the energy, the power of exciting vision of the red rays is several thousand times as great as the energy of the violet, and there is regular and rapid decrease of energy as we pass down the spectrum from red to violet. It is plain that if there has been any such a thing, a growing perfection in the sense of vision, in virtue of which, from being insensible to the color of the eye, became gradually sensible of it, red would necessarily be the first color perceived, then yellow, then green, and so on to violet, and this exactly is what both ancient literature and etymology tell us took place. The comparative modernness of the color sense is further attested by the large numbers of persons in all countries who are what is called colorblind, that is, persons who are at the present day entirely or partially without any color sense. Wilson's assertion that probably 1 in 5 and 20 is colorblind long remained doubted because not proved in reference to sufficiently large numbers. Till we had comparison methods and principally Hogengren's, no satisfactory data could be obtained. His improper hand so quickly decides a case that tests have already been made in thousands of persons. Based on at least 200,000 examinations is the result that 4% of males are colorblind in either a greater or lesser degree, and 1/4 of 1% of females. This would make one case of colorblindness to every 47 persons. The degree of universality of the color sense in a race is, of course, an important fact in estimating its degree of evolution as compared with other races. In this connection of the following facts of interest: in Japan are among 1,200 soldiers, 1.58% were red blind, and 0.83% green blind. Among 373 boys, 1% were red blind. Among 270 girls, 0.4%. Among 596 men examined by Dr. Berry of Kyoto, 5.45% showed defective color sense. Among the Japanese as a whole, the percentage of color blindness is less than in Europeans or Americans. Among 796 Chinese examined in various places, no cases of color blindness were found, but there was a tendency often seen to mix green and blue together. This peculiarity was brought out with much greater emphasis by Dr. Field of Swachow, China, who examined 1,200 Chinese of both sexes using Thompson's wool tests. Among the 600 men were 19 who were colorblind, and among 600 women, only 1. The percentage of color blindness among Chinamen is then about 3%, and does not vary greatly from that of Europeans. In color blindness, the general vision is not affected. The individual distinguishes light and shade, form and distance, as well as do other persons. This also goes to show that the color sense is more superficial, less fundamental, and probably therefore acquired later than the other powers that belong to the function of sight. For a person could not lose one of the more fundamental elements of vision, the sense of visual form, for instance, and retain the other sight faculties unimpaired. Color blindness is in fact an instance of what is called atavism, or relapse to a condition which was normal in the ancestry of the individual, but which does not properly belong to the species at all. The time in which he lives, at least. The frequency of this relapse, estimated as we have seen to occur in 1 person out of every 47, indicates that the color sense is comparatively modern, for atavism is more frequent in inverse proportion to the length of time that has elapsed since the organ or function lost or improperly taken on, as the case may be, has, in the one case, normally existed in the race, or in the other, been discarded in the process of evolution. The rationale of this law, which will be again referred to, is obvious. It depends on the simple fact that the longer any organ or function has been in existence in a race, the more certainly will it be inherited. The existence of color blindness, then, in so large a percentage of the population shows that the color sense is a modern faculty. The relative visibility of the different colored rays makes it certain that if the color sense was acquired, it would be undoubtedly have been in the order in which philologists claim it actually was acquired, and the concurrence of these two sets of facts, the one drawn from natural philosophy and the other from etymology, together with the fact of color blindness, is so striking that it seems impossible to refuse assent to the conclusions reached.